now we move from England back to France. You might have seen the film on her a few years ago. It's Colette, the most famous of our French women on the podcast.
Maybe most famous in her time in France, we can say.
Excuse you, people still read her books in school. All right, I had to do that in French class.
That's pretty cool. No, I just hadn't heard of her until you told me about her, so.
Born Sidonie-Gabrielle Colette in January 1873 in central France, she was the youngest child of a crippled French soldier turned tax collector who was her mother's second husband. The villagers didn't look kindly on her mother because of the possible affair with her second husband while the first was alive, even though the first one also had a mistress at the time. But scandal aside, Colette's upbringing is rather normal and boring. It was a Catholic musically inclined family, and she went to the local public school.
Huh. Unlike a lot of the women here, she had a normal upbringing. I do wonder if her father being a tax collector might have also affected their reputation.
Probably no one likes tax collectors, even if they're one-legged. However, by the time she was 15, the family was in debt.
Even after all that tax collecting?
Oh yeah, they had to sell their last property, and now they only had her father's meager military pension to live on. So soon there was a public auction of their possessions, though not her childhood home, oddly enough, because her oldest brother now owned that.
Do we know why they fell on this financial hardship?
None of the biographies went into detail.
Mysterious. So the fates took a sudden turn, I guess.
I mean, how many people do you know who are good at personal finance? Not many.
Fair enough.
Either way, 3 years later, they moved to a nearby town where Colette's two older brothers lived. Then, in 1891, she graduated secondary school at age 19. Though the headmistress encouraged her to continue her education, the move to a different town prevented that. Instead, it appeared that she would follow the familiar route for a woman in the countryside, either marriage, spinsterhood, or teaching at the local school. That is not what happened. Instead, she met Henri Gautier-Villard, aka Willie. Already a widower with a son taken care of by foster parents, Willie was already a popular novelist down from Paris, as his legitimized son was then lodged with a wet nurse near the town Colette lived in after the boy's mother suddenly died. Willie's mother was later persuaded to raise the boy.
Convenient.
Yes, very convenient for Colette. She isn't automatically a parent at, age 20.
Mm-hmm. Wow, 20. So I'm just thinking that the whole, she's consigned to spinsterhood until this guy shows up. 20.
It's a different time.
It's a different time.
After they met, Colette's mother was anxious for the blossoming relationship to continue. This led to Colette's initial visits to Paris, and by the end of 1892, they were engaged. Despite this, Willie was not as enthusiastic as one would imagine. Due to previous affairs and his son, the man had few options for a good marriage. On Colette's end, Willie was an escape from the provincial town and supposed spinsterhood that awaited her. She was also in love. This was more than enough motivation for the wedding in May 1893. Though it was a simple wedding. Willie's family didn't attend. They had held out hope for a woman with a sizable dowry and presumably social connections, and he had only 2 friends as witnesses. The next day, the couple left for Paris.
I gotta say, this is a weird beginning. I mean, you've just listed some very good reasons for them to get married, but it does not seem like a whirlwind romance.
Define whirlwind romance. We're not talking about Natalie Barney here.
I'm not getting the vibe that he's, like, into her so much as she is his last option or something.
As we will see, Willie tended to be the sort of person who seems to recreate the same scenario in every relationship he does, like constantly chasing something and never quite getting it.
Interesting. So this is but foreshadowing.
Sure, but you know where there aren't any shadows? Paris, which was a revelation, by the way. Cabaret, dance, music and theater, the Folies Bergère and Moulin Rouge, Art Nouveau in full swing, the Eiffel Tower built for the 1889 Exposition, and naturally only a few years old now as carriages progressed up and down long open boulevards. It was all a far cry from a small country town of little options for any unconventionality. She was 20, and her new 34-year-old husband whisked her into the center of the artistic world of the right bank, where Winnaretta Singer, the Princess de Polignac, presided over a salon. Colette now rubbed elbows with the established and rising writers of her era. This was all helped along by the curiosity at who exactly Willie had managed to marry. Despite the social whirl and newness, Colette was disillusioned and lonely. Willie was out from dawn till the middle of the night. She spent all day waiting for him to return after breakfast and to whisk her away to the evening's dinner and entertainment. There were times Colette longed for the simple but more activity-filled life of the village.
This feels like almost, although they're kind of living this unconventional life here, they've reverted to the gender roles of the time where she's not allowed to leave the home until he takes her out.
A little bit, yeah, but I can also imagine there's a lot of, I don't know who anyone here is, please help.
Yeah, I'm not saying that he's doing this to her. I'm saying she's part of this too. She is trapped in her own prison.
A prison of her mind?
Yes. Thank you.
Well, on top of that, we can add in the fact that Willie had never given up his mistresses.
Oof. Did she know about this?
Well, you see, someone decided to send an anonymous letter one day. She left for a strange address and found him with one mistress bent over an accounting book. The position was apparently more shocking to her than the affair, though.
It's pretty shocking. Like, can you guys not wait to put everything away, or what?
I imagine he didn't really care if the accounting book was put away or not, but anyway, Colette, innocent village girl then, a far cry from the older, more famous version, which would go on to seduce her stepson and scandalize Paris with a lesbian pantomime.
Yeah, so there was some change throughout her time in that city.
Paris does change people. By mid-1894, Colette was quite depressed from being thrown far off kilter with this move and everything. She seemed to have lost all taste for life. Over the next few months, she was slowly nursed back to health by her mother, who hurried to her daughter's side, as well as by her new friends, a few writers she met in Paris because of her husband. There was also Madame Armande de Caillevet, another salon hostess and one of Proust's literary models, who quite liked Colette and came with treats of pineapples and peaches with her bossy voice and outrageous perfumes, which seemed to help snap Colette out of her funk.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, because after an additional 2 months over in Brittany, she was back in Paris with Willie.
See, I feel like the problem here, hot takes, might be Willie.
Now comes the writing part. The Claudine novels were not actually the first thing Colette ever had published. Instead, she made her literary debut writing a number of articles about music for a short-lived review, La Cocarde. All 6 articles were signed Colette Gautier-Villard. Then, in the summer of 1895, Colette and Willie returned to Saint-Sauveur as guests of honor at the school's prize-giving ceremony. This was the town that Colette had been living in when she met Willie. It was perhaps this trip, when they had stayed in the girls' dormitory, that prompted Willie to suggest that his wife should jot down some of the schoolgirl memories she had recounted to him, and hence the Claudine novels. Now, as many are probably aware going into this story, Willie had an entire stable's worth of ghostwriters since 1894. In fact, I have my doubts over whether the man actually wrote anything on his own after getting them.
That would be the temptation, right? You have these people employed. Might as well make use of them.
Yes, but as a writer, you keep getting ideas. You are obviously going to write them down. Like, why would you use a ghostwriter? But anyway.
Well, because he needs to use all of his fun ideas to seduce women, obviously. And once he's out of ideas, he needs the ghostwriters to write everything down.
That sounds like someone with very few ideas to begin with.
Well, who knows? Who knows what happened?
What we do know is that with funds low, he perhaps thought he might be able to make something out of Colette's recollections of her school days. So, Colette bought herself a number of notebooks, just like she had used at school, and started to write, creating the character of Claudine, her first literary alter ego. Some months later, she handed the notebooks to Willie, who, after taking a cursory look at them, decided the work was not publishable and stuffed them into a drawer.
Oof, wow.
Both thought that was the end of it. As we know today, it was not.
Yeah, talk about an auspicious beginning, though.
4 years later, Willie was cleaning out that desk and came across the notebooks. Bored or curious, he started flipping through them, and then he realized he could do something with them. So he rushed out the door to his editor with his arms full of his wife's notebooks. The manuscript needed a bit of spicing up, but it was publishable.
Now, what do we mean by spicing up?
Well, you see, Colette started following Willie's suggestions of adding jokes, puns, local slang, and a bit of scandalous material.
Gotcha.
If you can't read between the lines already from all of this, it's lesbian antics, basically.
Nice.
I mean, what else would you do at a girls' boarding school?
Right. Well, I mean, clearly, it's, as we all know, girls' boarding schools are very salacious places.
Oh yeah, hotbed of Sapphism just set up the altar to Sappho already. She's now the new patron deity.
To be fair, I have heard from some people who did go to like single gender boarding schools, and there was some of that going on. But I can't help but imagine that Willie and other men who were involved in this maybe were urging along some of the wilder fantasies there.
Oh, undoubtedly. And thus was born a 1901 bestseller under Willie's name.
Well, you know.
This was followed quickly by sequels in the later part of 1901, then in 1902 and 1903. This outpouring of words was helped along by him once locking Colette in a room for 4 hours a day to write more.
That's not really helping along, is it? That's torturing her or something?
Maybe not torturing, but certainly captivity of some variety.
Definitely abusing in some way. Like, that's not how you treat someone.
Well, that's just the beginning with this relationship.
Love to hear it.
But back to the writing. Looking back on these Claudine novels, Colette was not particularly proud of them. They had a certain youthful freshness, but they were tainted by a lack of discretion and a careless disregard for hurting people.
I wonder where she got that instinct from.
I think we can make a reasonable guess.
Mm-hmm.
They were, after all, novels drawn from her own experiences, though Claudine is not Colette. For one, Claudine has no mother and she lives in a different part of France, but still there are parodies of teachers and friends in them. For instance, if I remember right, Natalie Barney and possibly Eva Palmer end up in the third book.
Oh, wow. So she's really going for it. Yeah, how did all of her friends who presumably knew her and read these books, how did they respond to these? It sounds like pretty blatant parodies of them.
very mixed reactions.
Yeah, I can imagine.
In fact, it led to a scandal.
Oh.
You see, one book is just straight ripped from Colette's marriage to Willie, complete with meltdown lesbian affair and just everything that makes it incredibly complicated.
Go on.
So the character of Resi, who is a Viennese beauty with whom Claudine has an affair, is modeled on Georgie Raoul Duval, the daughter of a rich family from Louisiana. In 1891, Georgie had married René Raoul Duval, the scion of a wealthy and distinguished family. Georgie was an extremely attractive and charming woman. Willie and Colette had met her in the salon of Madame Jean Moulfeld. The liaison between Colette and Georgie appears to have started around the time of the publication of Claudine in Paris, so roughly March 1901, and ended by October of that year. Now, in the summer, Georgie had certainly been in Bayreuth with both Colette and Willie, and the relationship had become a threesome to an extent.
Interesting.
And when I say that, I mean it is very possible that Georgie was involved with Willie before she started her affair with Colette, and also that for quite a while, Colette was unaware she was sharing a mistress with her husband.
Interesting choices on everyone's part there. I'd be tempted to say that's, like, bad of Georgie and Willie to be doing this to Colette, but they're also all doing this behind Georgie's husband's back, so it's like, really, guys? I guess this is just Paris, though.
To add into your probable confusion, this most definitely did not end as you'd think, because for some reason, Willie was only ever amused by Colette sleeping with women every time it happened.
So Willie is fine with Colette sleeping with Georgie.
Yes, in fact, he encouraged it.
I'm tempted to be like, is this him being gross? Because you know how guys get.
Possibly, but he did this every single time, including with women who were lesbians and most definitely were only interested in his wife.
Huh. So, sounds like maybe he was an unexpected ally. In this one circumstance only.
In a few circumstances that probably were not Georgie.
Right, fair.
Anyway, this three-way relationship was the inspiration for the next Claudine novel, although Colette claimed in a letter to Jean Moulfeld that it was Willie who was transforming her character Resi into an awfully recognizable Georgie. When Madame Raoul Duval was warned about the book's imminent publication, she offered the publishing house a considerable sum of money to pulp its print run. However, Willie was not to be deterred and took a slightly revised version of the manuscript to another publishing house, which was happy to run the risk of legal action, and so the book was published in the spring of 1902.
That seems like a dick move at that part. Like, you get that feedback, and probably you want to, edit it a bit, maybe run it by her before you try publishing.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Willie didn't care, and Colette was rather miffed at Georgie for sleeping with Willie.
So it's all fine. All's fair in love and war?
Very true. All is certainly fair in vengeance in print. Either way, no legal proceedings occurred, and the book was a success because of the scandal. There were 70,000 copies printed within just a few months.
Wow. And I guess, after it was published, Georgie couldn't really go and, sue them or anything, because then it would, definitively conclude that she was the one it was about.
Yeah, I really want to know how that discussion went at the dinner table with her husband.
Yeah, well, she could just be like, oh, that's someone else. I don't know who that's supposed to be. Clearly she's Viennese.
So from this we can assume that the best way to cause a bestseller is to have a scandal. So Pixie, write this down and then go find me a married Viennese countess masquerading as a rich Louisiana woman, or vice versa.
All right, noted. On my to-do list.
And now this success continued at a rapid pace. In 1902, a stage adaptation of the first two books catapulted Claudine to celebrity status. The role went to the actress Colette, who could look an awful lot like Colette herself. And this became a marketing scheme with the trio of Colette, Polaire, and Willie seen about town with each woman in matching clothes and haircuts.
That seems a bit weird. Like, A, these aren't supposed to be literally her. And B, I don't know. You've heard the expression the male gaze before?
Or just Willie's gaze.
Well, yeah, there's that.
Yeah, it's one of the other weird things that is just odd in this relationship. Either way, Polaire tolerated this exhibitionism reluctantly. She wrote later that she felt humiliated being paraded around Paris with Colette like a couple of Great Danes.
Mm-hmm.
Colette was more mellow. 10 years of living with Willie had given her a tougher skin, and she was not going to show her humiliation in public. She was learning to hide her private feelings behind the mask of her public persona.
Oh, so that's fine then.
I wouldn't call it fine. I think she was just far better at dealing with it. Now, amidst all this, enter one very blonde, very blue-eyed, very scandalous American.
Who could it be?
Colette and Willie met Natalie Barney in the salon of a countess, though not a Viennese one. Again, Willie was amused by the ensuing affair. As Colette wrote, "My husband kisses your hands, and me all the rest."
Ooh, spicy.
Now, this was not a serious affair, and much like the one with Georgie, it was a seasonal fling, with one caveat. This transformed into a lifelong friendship, and later it was at Natalie's salon that Colette debuted in a pantomime opposite Eva Palmer a few years later, though they would both have stage fright, mess up their lines, and then the guy whose work they were performing would afterwards say he had the great pleasure of hearing his work recited by both Tolstoy and Mark Twain.
What does that even mean?
They messed up their lines primarily with their accents, so Colette ended up sounding Russian and Eva Palmer ended up sounding like Mark Twain.
Excellent. Excellent. But you know what? I'm glad that Natalie provided this space for creative freedom.
Oh yeah, she would literally write to Willie being like, "Can I borrow your wife for an afternoon's entertainment in my garden?"
Beautiful.
But now 31 years old, Colette was starting to break away from Willie.
31, so she's still not quite as old as he was when he married her.
No, but it has been over a decade.
And she has learned enough and become independent enough that she doesn't need to cling on to his apron strings.
It wasn't that good of an apron to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
It started simply with gymnastics and progressed to miming and dancing.
Now, I was wondering about this. Where did she learn this? Was there some, gymnastics master that she started hanging out with?
No, but at one point there was this sort of gym with bars installed into their apartment.
Ooh.
Though the miming and the dancing she definitely learned from someone, and I'm assuming someone taught her the basics of gymnastics.
Gotcha. So part of this too is that she has this community of people outside of Willie's circle.
Yeah, possibly starting really with Natalie, just come to my garden for the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
I'll introduce you to even more people on accident.
Mm-hmm.
Miming and dancing and gymnastics doesn't seem like much. But it allowed her to break away without becoming destitute. Despite this, she didn't leave. She couldn't quite figure out where to go, and she did kinda still love him. And things get very murky here. So, there's two different versions. There's one where he starts the breakup, and there's one where she makes the first move. And yet at the same time, we do know that each of them is pursuing a different person at this time. Willie had yet another woman throwing herself at him because of the Claudine novels.
And not at Colette?
Colette had other women being thrown at her, but yeah, Willie, because he was supposedly the writer of the Claudine novels, women just threw themselves at him throughout the years.
Because he understands women so well. Because he writes them as if he really gets it.
As if you would think you were a cunning linguist.
Nah, but I suspect that is in fact the person who's actually writing.
Indeed. Now, Colette had Missy, the Marquise de Belleboeuf, with whom she later performed a pantomime on stage that caused a riot because of a kiss.
Ooh.
Now, in fact, Willie basically introduced the two women one night at a club, but he probably didn't realize that this time would last longer than the others. By the end of summer 1906, Colette and Willie were living separately in Paris. However, this didn't lead to an amicable divorce. Also, by this time, she was publishing fiction under her own name.
Big step for her.
However, this didn't mean she made any money from it. So she went on the stage instead.
Scandalous.
Yes, a very scandalous choice for the time.
Mm-hmm.
It may have been acceptable for her to perform in private, but a public performance was a different matter, particularly given the rather risque nature of some of the mimes in which she performed, which included not only the lesbian ancient Egypt one with Missy, but also there is a photo of presumably one performance where half of her chest is bare.
Oh, well. And of course, we all know what type of woman performs publicly.
Oh, yes. Why else was Leanne de Pougy taking acting lessons from Sarah Bernhardt?
Yeah, right. Acting lessons. It is funny, though, because these women can do all sorts of things, like, amongst each other, and it's kind of hand-waved away because they're all so rich and no one's going to say anything. But, like, the minute it becomes something that the poor people can see, too, like, oh, okay, I guess it's a scandal now.
It's less that the poor people can see it and more that it's performed publicly and not behind closed doors.
Yeah, but, like, how many people are behind those closed doors, you know?
It's like the difference between having an orgy in your dining room and setting up an orgy in a park.
I think those are both pretty scandalous. I hate to break this to you.
Basically, the difference is everyone who's behind closed doors is basically taking a part in it, even if it's the audience of a pantomime. It's not something that's going to be talked about in the press or anything else. It's just their own little, like, inside joke.
Well, the rich people, I still think it's a class thing. I think the rich people keep to themselves and protect each other. But those poors.
Well, yes, but Colette isn't rich, but she has been a part of this.
She has been accepted into their society as one of them.
Either way, over the next 7 years, Colette performed in both Paris and the provinces, being a mime in various new pieces, and then also playing the role of Claudine, which was originally done by Polaire. At times, some compared her to the likes of Isadora Duncan, a well-known experimental dancer of the time. Others said she couldn't move right on a stage, let alone dance.
Imagine you're like risking it all and becoming a huge like center of scandal, and people are like, and she can't even dance.
I mean, a lot of people probably said the same about Isadora Duncan. Either way, Colette did not take criticism well, and she kept going.
Wow. So she didn't take criticism well, but she didn't let it stop her.
Colette was also more fully diving into what was at times called Le Tout Lesbos, basically the lesbian side of Paris. This included social visits to Renee Vivian's vacation villa and masked balls in the south of France, which, by the way, was attended by all three of the top courtesans of the time, and whom we have episodes on, by the way.
Oh, hint, hint.
Yeah, I love the fact that Otero just props up, and yet she's supposedly straight.
Well, just to see.
She'd just rather party with the lesbians.
I mean, I've heard of that happening, like women going to gay bars because they're like, I don't want to be around straight men right now.
Mm-hmm. It was from this time that Colette would later take inspiration when writing the novel The Pure and the Impure.
Oh. Now, who among these people are the pure?
You could say that's up for debate. And now, despite this change in career to the stage, Colette kept writing, with 2 more books published by the time the divorce went through in 1910. As I said, it was not amicable, especially after she learned Willie sold the rights to the Claudine novels to the publisher.
Really, Willie?
So she didn't make much money, but luckily she had Missy's money to rely on quite a bit whenever she joined her on tour. Rather than cold theaters, squalid hotels, and whatever you can get for food, they'd have first-class train tickets, luxury hotels, and the best restaurants. Hell, Colette even lived in the same house as Missy in Paris by then.
Wow, so she is doing this acting thing in style.
Gotta love a rich girlfriend.
Yeah.
So basically, Colette became increasingly dependent on the little luxuries of life that Missy could offer her. She also grew to rely on her to ward off her own feelings of loneliness. For her part, Missy had no expectations of Colette. She recognized her for the spoiled, self-indulgent being that she was, and was happy to do all she could to keep Colette in her presence, including ignoring when Colette had an affair with Auguste Ariel, heir to the Grand Magazine du Louvre department store fortune.
Oh. So one rich lover to the next.
She also helped Colette deal with her distress and unhappiness at the definitive split with Willie. You see, Colette's feelings towards him were complex, and right until the end she thought they might become a couple again.
Oof.
In short, very messy emotions here. And then Colette and Missy bought a house in Brittany in 1910. And Colette signed the paperwork because the guy selling it wouldn't sell it to a woman wearing men's clothes.
Even if she was aristocracy and incredibly wealthy.
Yeah, some things you just couldn't get away with, unfortunately for Missy. Yeah. Also, unfortunately for her, she soon lost both Colette and the house.
Excuse me?
At the end of 1910, Colette began writing a regular column for the daily newspaper Le Matin. Within a few months, she was in a new relationship with Henri de Jouvenel, one of the newspaper's co-editors.
Come on, Colette, you had it good.
Missy was devastated by this betrayal. For 5 years, she had been a constant, loving, and generous companion to Colette, supporting her through the difficult times of her divorce with Willie and the legal battle over the rights to her works. Colette's affair with Auguste Ariel had not been a serious threat, as Colette had found him a charming but weak companion. In Jouvenel, however, she met someone who was her intellectual equal, ambitious, complex, and a passionate lover. She had seen the glimmer of happiness that life with a man she loved and admired offered, so she left Missy for him.
Flighty bisexual. I say, as a bisexual, who is not flighty! Come on, Colette, giving us all a bad name.
The stereotype had to come from somewhere.
I guess. I mean, I get it, because it is a lot easier to live life in a heterosexual kind of situation. Like, as we just saw, it was really hard for Missy to, get a house. So I get it. But, really, this woman supports you, all through your, toughest times. And as soon as you see a man who's interested in you, you're like, bye.
Yeah, so anyway, Colette and de Jouvenel were married in 1912, which made Colette the stepmother to his 2 sons, Bertrand and Renaud. And they were later joined by a new half-sister the next year when Colette gave birth at age 40. which, by the way, surprised Colette because she didn't think she'd ever have kids by that point, and she seemed rather ambivalent about it.
Yeah, I hope that daughter is all right, because Colette hasn't been giving strong mother vibes up to this point.
Yeah, when the war broke out the next year, she left the kid in the countryside with a nurse and only visited, because it turns out she was right to be ambivalent. Colette admired her daughter, was in awe before the perfection of this tiny being she created, but she never really felt maternal love. Many years later, Colette wrote that it wasn't until her daughter started to become a little girl, when she started to talk and express her own needs and desires, that she began to feel like she was a mother. However, in reality, Colette was always a distant mother. Like, she missed her kids' birthdays and didn't even visit when her daughter wrote letters from school begging her to visit.
Okay, yeah. Oof.
That being said, the kid had a rather normal childhood by upper-class standards of the day, cared for by servants, sent to boarding school at age 9 and then to England at 12 for school, and even after her schooling was over, she rarely saw her parents.
I feel like this speaks more to, like, upper-class standards than it does to Colette's parenting in particular. Because, my God!
I like to think that if your kid is writing begging letters from school to visit, especially when everyone else's mother is picking them up for the holidays, that, yeah, you should go and do that. Colette didn't do that.
Hint, hint, Colette.
This is not to say that Colette didn't love her daughter. It just wasn't the way anyone would want their parents to love them. Instead, it was a love expressed in high standards and a burden of expectation. She wanted to see her daughter succeed rather than waste her talents. And the true tragedy of this kid's life, as indeed Colette saw it, was that she was the daughter of two famous people. Basically, the kid was never going to measure up to the yardstick set by her parents' lives and fame.
So Colette just had to have really high expectations. That doesn't seem like a good solution.
It wasn't. But meanwhile, there was World War I. While Colette still had some writing work for newspaper columns, her income was reduced, as was that of her friends. So they basically formed a commune to cut down on expenses, and all lived in the same house in Paris. During this time, she may have had a fling with one of those friends, Musidora, who later became a rather well-known film actress. This state of things didn't last long, as Colette became essentially a part-time night nurse in mid-October for a school that was converted to a military hospital.
Wow, so I guess everyone's doing their part.
Yes, including her husband, who is at the front lines in the army. And the thing is, Colette couldn't bear this separation, so she forged papers, went to the front, and spent Christmas with him.
Aww.
Contrast this to all the time she tried to spend time with her daughter. She managed to do this by hiding in an apartment in Verdun that belonged to an officer and his wife. This lasted till February, when she returned to Paris. She then spent the rest of the war as a reporter, traveling between fronts, including down to Italy. And then finally the war ended and her second husband survived to return to Paris with her.
Now, can I just say, that's like a lot of different things to be doing. Like, how is she getting, this job that she has as the night nurse? How is she getting work as a reporter? I'm just like, it's so much effort to come up with that resume and cover letter.
Connections, and she wasn't a nurse for very long.
Just long enough to look the part, I guess? Or do we know if she actually, gained medical knowledge from this, or?
Probably about as much as other people. I mean, Leanne de Pougy became a nurse, Lily de Grandmont became a nurse, a whole bunch of women became nurses overnight, basically. And when I say nurse, I don't mean trained nurse that you're thinking of. Think instead it's like you're taking over, changing sheets and dressings and bedpans and maybe figuring out how to administer, pain meds and things and bringing meals.
Gotcha. So it's the basic functions.
Yeah, it's like the freeing up the actual nurse position to, then be able to go and attend an amputation.
Excellent.
the marriage, the having a kid, all of it does not prevent Colette from seducing her 17-year-old stepson Bertrand in 1920 when she was 50 in an affair that lasted for 5 years.
Colette, problematic fave.
Insert references to stepmother jokes here.
Yeah, like, or maybe just say, like, oh, you thought she was a bad mom? She's an even worse stepmom.
I mean, some teenage boys might not say the worst.
Yeah. See, that's the thing is, like, I don't know. I think maybe she didn't horribly traumatize him, but quite possibly she did, right? Like, that just doesn't seem like a relationship that is built on good terms.
I mean, we know she provided him with this whole love, tenderness, discipline, and direction that had not been forthcoming from his birth parents. And oddly enough, this was in the same year that she won Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, so, like, she's getting more fame, and at the time she decides to embark on a very scandalous affair.
So she is, like, sacrificing somewhat to do this. On the other hand, she could have provided him with love and tenderness and discipline and direction by just being his stepmom.
Yes, but the other end of this equation is Colette being full of energy and passion that she was happy to bestow upon him, following her own advice as she wrote to her dear friend Marguerite Moreno. Take advantage of a temptation that passes and indulge it. What can we be sure of, other than what we hold in our arms, at the very moment when we are holding it? The opportunity to possess is rare.
As someone who had been possessed when she was 20, I feel like she should know that this is not a good situation. Like, is she still healing from the whole Willie thing? Because I feel like this is just her doing that, but to someone else.
As much as we dive into other people's psychology and just brains on this show, I don't necessarily have the answers.
Yeah, no, I'm putting forth a hypothesis, but I don't expect to be 100% correct. We can never know. We can't ask these people. We aren't their therapists.
And the dead don't answer their phone.
Right.
Either way, this naturally puts an end to Colette's second marriage. Divorcing in 1925 as a result. But this would not be the last time Colette married.
Please tell me she doesn't marry the stepson.
She does not. The stepson would go on to have an affair with Martha Gellhorn.
Ah, well, there you go. It's all coming together.
In a way, you could say it all comes together is very much a web, a series of interconnecting tunnels down here. No, instead she would go on to marry Maurice Goudiquet in 1935, though they would meet for the first time in 1925.
And now how old is he? Is he a teenager too?
No.
Well, at least there's that.
No, he's about 15 years younger than her.
That's fine. You know what, Colette? At least you figured it out.
I mean, you really shouldn't be surprised when this is the woman who would hang around in Riots' house, that famous courtesan who would literally be talking about how she wanted to retire to the south of France with a pool boy.
Yeah. Different ideas of what's acceptable back then, I guess.
Anyway, Colette continues to write and also tries her hand at other things. This included a short stint in beauty products in 1932 as Maurice's businesses were struggling during the Great Depression. Now, they're not quite married just yet, but the way they act, they're married without the paperwork.
A power couple.
I mean, there's been several power couples, you could say, with Colette. Anyway, when it comes to the whole beauty thing, you can think of it as the same as when influencers launch cosmetic and drink companies and promote them to their audiences. It's capitalizing on the already established fame or brand. But still, the business failed in a few years.
No.
Hey, it's the Great Depression.
Right, fair enough. People aren't out there like, yeah, let's get some beauty products.
The writing side was doing all right, if you discount finances. Colette was elected to the Belgian Royal Academy of French Language and Literature in 1935, because the death of the poet Anna de Noailles left the seat vacant. And here we come to the end of the 1930s.
And we all know what that means.
World War II was not a good time.
Yeah, not for most people.
Not only is France occupied this time around, but her third husband is Jewish. This is not a good combo.
Yeah, no.
So first he's arrested for being a Jew. Colette actually went and begged for his release from a detention camp to the northeast of Paris.
Oh, so she's actually cares for people sometimes. Wow. Colette, doing the bare minimum.
He was released after 7 weeks, mostly because the French wife of the German ambassador knew Colette and liked her writing.
So she can't use her fame to sell beauty products, but at least she can use it in this one instance.
Yeah, and then Maurice ended up getting to the free zone in the south of France on false papers, but the free zone was no longer safe after bureaucratic changes in 1942 because puppet French government.
Oof.
He then fled to friends in a remote area of France. However, Colette was anxious and became increasingly depressed as the war dragged on. So Maurice decided to risk it all to return to Paris to be with her.
No, they should both be leaving this entire continent.
For the rest of the war, he lived in Paris, taking refuge every night in various different locations in the building. The maid's room, the bookshop downstairs, so on and so forth. A closet who knows where.
Wow, that sounds terrifying. And also sounds like the beginning of a lot of stories that end with, and then they all died in concentration camps. I'm so mad at these historical people for not just, leaving.
I mean, lots of people mess up. Natalie thought she could ride out the war in Italy without fear of anything.
Yeah.
Now, aged 70, Colette was in a crippling amount of pain due to arthritis in her hips, so she rarely moved from her apartment. But this didn't stop her writing. She described her writing at the time as fulfilling the mission of the poet, to forget reality, to promise the world miracles, to sing of victory, and to deny death. The book Gigi certainly fell into this category. Written in 1942, it recounted the story of a young girl brought up in a world that was familiar to Colette's readers, of courtesans, performers, and idle, wealthy young men. This light novella met with resounding success in the middle of the war.
That sounds like a nice distraction amid all of that.
It was, but the war dragged on, and life became increasingly difficult. The horrors of war bore down on both friends and family. Friends were arrested, 2 of Colette's Jewish friends committed suicide, and Colette was worrying about her daughter and her other stepson, Renaud, as well as others who were increasingly involved with the resistance. Not to mention her husband practically hiding under the floorboards. And then 2 of her younger friends were dying of incurable diseases because medicine and supplies are all messed up from the war. And then her brother Leo had died in early 1940 and was the last link of her family because, as the youngest, she is left all alone.
Wow, so a pretty grim time all around.
As 1944 dragged on, and the Allied forces closed in on Paris, bombs started falling again. At ground level, the sharpshooters were the most sinister, along with the German tanks that continued to fire in the narrow streets nearby, before they surrendered. Maurice, who went out to see the fighting, was caught in the... he was caught in the Tuileries garden, but still. He was forced to lie low in the gardens for 3 days, unable to leave as the sharpshooters fired on anything that moved.
And this was before they had cell phones, so Colette was just didn't know what was going on, right?
Oh yeah, she was frantic with worry and had people out looking for him amongst the dead. When he got back, she welcomed him home with a string of insults.
Yeah. I mean, none of us have been, hopefully, in any of this, type of situation before. But I don't think I would go out just to see the fighting.
I would.
Well, there you are, I guess. I mean, and it had been years. I can see being frustrated, being cooped up for years.
But anyway, the years after the war brought great glory and honor to Colette, though she still spent a great deal of time in bed due to arthritis. In 1945, she was elected to the Académie Goncourt, and 4 years later was elected president by her fellow members.
Now, what is the Académie Goncourt?
It is responsible for choosing the recipient of the Prix Goncourt, the most coveted literary prize in France, awarded for the best and most imaginative prose of the year. Not to mention, her work was being picked up by Hollywood. Gigi was turned into a stage play and later film in the 1950s, starring Audrey Hepburn and later Leslie Caron. Other films of her work, like Cherie, followed. However, Colette would not see all of these. By the start of 1954, Colette was becoming less lucid and more easily distracted. Not surprising for someone passing her 80th birthday. After a last trip of a few months to Monte Carlo, as had been her habit with Maurice since 1950, she returned to Paris and died in her bed on August 3rd, 1954, with her husband and her daughter beside her. Despite being refused a church funeral by the Archbishop of Paris because she was scandalous, she had a grand state funeral, the first ever granted to a woman by the French Republic, and 10,000 people paid homage to her as her body lay in state. Colette's funeral was held on August 7th in the courtyard of the Palais Royal, with speeches and the trumpeters of the National Guard playing Chopin's Funeral March. And then she was buried during one of the most violent storms of the century in Père-Lachaise Cemetery, where many people from her time and life also have graves.
Ah, so it sounds like even the heavens are crying out.
Oh yeah, so grand a funeral for a woman who hated funerals. Because, as she wrote, death should never be something public. And yet, she would have at least enjoyed the fact the storm broke out when they tried to put her in the ground. Thank you for listening. Subscribe wherever you are. Check out our Twitter. And remember, if you're starting to think your stepson is hot, just don't.
Just don't, he's 17.